Yeah, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Zai. I often work collaboratively in Singapore, and I wear a few different hats. Sometimes I do sound design, composition stuff. Other times I kind of wear the hat as a sound artist for different contexts. Sometimes it's film, other times it's dance, or sometimes it's installation works. But today I'm going to be sharing more about my solo practice, specifically talking about a series of work I've been doing about Bukit Brown. It's an ongoing project which kind of looks and concentrates on how the soundscape of Bukit Brown has changed over the past few years with the introduction of the highway. But rather than sort of focusing on my intentions, like what I want to sort of say through the work, I'm going to sort of zoom into one aspect of it, which is how sound can be visualized in different ways, and how certain modes of listening can inform this process. So just to give a bit of background, back in March 2013, I walked a lot around Bukit Brown, mostly just to kind of escape the density of Singapore's soundscape and find a bit of peace of mind. So over the months that followed, I kind of listened very intently as I was walking around the cemetery, and I began making field recordings until I'd covered a cycle of 24 hours at the cemetery, like in total. And most of the life I encountered there was heard rather than seen. The presence of these creatures, or being of these creatures, was sort of felt rather than observed. So this in part kind of led me towards experimenting with different ways of making visible this experience. So I started to draw in response to the field recordings I'd made, and this was the first recording I made a drawing to. Feel free to close your eyes if you feel comfortable doing that. So naturally, we kind of have a tendency to relate a sound to its source, like what caused that sound. But when I tried to listen for this project, I kind of tried to hone or kind of practice ignoring the source and concentrating on the contents of the sound. So what I mean by that is, let's say we forget the horse entirely and just focus on the sound itself. Perhaps we can sort of describe its form as something quite angular and sharp, sort of talking about the main cluster in the center of the image. Basically, to my ears, it's kind of like a cluster of discrete or individual sounds. In other words, when the hoof hits the concrete, it has a very definite impact or attack, and then disappears. There's only a very kind of minute trace of it acoustically with the reverberations. So like in tandem, these kind of clusters of sound create a sort of jagged rhythm. There is a sort of groove to it, but it sort of phases in and out of sync because it's actually two horses. So it's, 8 hooves altogether, creating different rhythms. I'll play it again. And of course, we hear a sort of like material aspect and textural element to the sound. We're hearing sort of sand, gravel, and concrete all together. And of course, I'm referring back to a source, but you know, they each have their own sonic characteristics. And I tried to make little marks in relation to those with the kind of dots and rough shading and that kind of thing. So, I mean, of course, it's all very visually subjective, how I've translated the sound, but I think when you do practice listening intently on the kind of, what you'd say are the contents of the sound or the intrinsic properties of it, you can train your ears to sort of pick up more details in that sound. So let me play you another example. This time, maybe try listening and block out any kind of scene if a scene starts to appear in your mind. In other words, like forget the forest or the birds, but maybe you want to try and just listen to the way the sound changes over time and note its sort of qualities and characteristics. So just a short clip there. So I'll play it again. This time it'll be slowed down and see if that helps to make the form clearer. So to me, like the sort of form of that sound is much more fluid. You've kind of got this fluctuating melodic content, and the pitch is sort of modulating and gliding between notes. So to me, this sort of suggested much more curved motifs and softer edges rather than the sort of straight, hard lines of the last sound of the horse hooves. Similarly, I wanted to kind of express a little bit of its kind of lyrical qualities with a bit more movement in the marks and gestures that I made. So I made a bunch of sketches, and these all sort of fed into a final work of sorts, which was a visual score I created in response to a sort of naturalistic soundscape composition that I pressed onto a dubplate record, which you see pictured. This is the sort of final work, the installation view. So I kind of used the visual element to kind of both evoke a sense of place and atmosphere that I experienced there, but also to kind of aid listening in a way, to bring the audience closer to these kind of intrinsic expressions of the creatures I encountered. Yeah, and here's another close-up view. These are other kind of interpretations of the bird we just heard, the straw-headed bulbul, or bara, as it's also known. So, yeah, just to reiterate, I kind of don't really make use of any real-world visual references to the thing or creature that created the sound within these works, and I'm more interested in trying to kind of tap into the quote-unquote inner life of the sound, so to speak. And by this I mean using different marks, gestures, or mediums to express, for example, a sound's texture, its dynamics, its rhythm, character, and how it changes over time. So this means of listening could be referred to as reduced listening, and it's a means of listening to sound whilst ignoring the source that created it, and it is a term that was coined by Pierre Schaeffer, the founder of Musique Concrète. So he said, often surprised, often uncertain, we discovered that much of what we thought we were hearing was in reality only seen and explained by the context. So, you know, to me, sort of following on from that, after we do remove a sound from its context and shift our attention away from causality to our perception, it can suddenly become much more ambiguous and open up different sort of potentials of what it can be or mean. So whilst I was making that work, in tandem, I was collaborating with a friend of mine, Simon Bull, who's a visual artist and specialises in motion graphics and animation. So with this piece, I used the same source material, various birds and some insects and whatnot, but treated it much more heavily. And I worked very closely with Simon to create quite a tight relationship between sound and image. I'll just play you a short excerpt from that. Yeah, so we kind of aimed to create a sort of synesthetic experience where the line between the sound and the image, begin to blur. So as I worked with Simon and learnt how he used After Effects in terms of the possibilities of manipulating image and video, I decided to change my setup for the sound design to better respond to his visuals. So as pictured, there's a vinyl on my turntable, and it basically, I used that in conjunction with this software called Tractor, and it's a DJ software. So effectively, this vinyl has what's called a time code written into it, and it allows you to kind of manipulate an audio file in the software in real time. So any gesture or manipulation you do with your hand on the vinyl would sound like it would do if the sound was cut onto a real record and then manipulated with your hand. So what that allowed was kind of more natural gestures and responses. And I kind of improvised with it whilst watching the video back, and did sort of overdubbing and cut from those takes, things that I felt worked. On top of that, I also used the effects in Tractor. You can hear them quite clearly at the beginning, where there's lots of sort of chopped up and spliced iterations of that particular sound, because I felt it fitted well with the kind of spliced, cut up, quite frenetic image that was at the start. So yeah, moving on, the next incarnation of the work was more of an experiment of sorts, and I wanted to see how I could work with creating sort of the visual element live. So I began sort of using charcoal in my hands in response to my field recordings, and it sort of culminated in a performance. I thought that the sort of being present, making the marks, would kind of, in the moment, would perhaps bring more of a sense of urgency and energy to the experience of listening to. So that work led me to what I'm currently working on when I find time. And for this work, I sort of revisited my archive of field recordings from Book-it Brown and tried to find, tried to find new ways of working with it in terms of visualization and also instrumentation. So for the sound material, I started to work in Ableton and exploring its capabilities for sampling. And what I did was kind of create virtual instruments using bird songs, insects, and other sounds to improvise with. Rather than talk too much about it, I'll just sort of play something for you instead. Okay, so I wasn't actually trying to make something that sounded so cohesive sonically there, as you might have been able to tell. Actually, I was trying to draw with the sound. What I mean by that will become clear in a minute. Basically, I'm going to just export that audio that you just heard. So just give me a second whilst I do that. Okay. Yeah, so whilst I was working on this project, I was also working a lot with dialogue and this post-production software for cleaning dialogue. And it uses spectrogram analysis, which is a very detailed way of visualizing sound. In this case, it's for the intention of picking out details of things that you don't want to be there and removing them. But what I discovered was that actually the images that could be created were quite beautiful, and also sort of accessed maybe a more objective way of looking at how sound can create sort of gestures. I'll play you what we just heard with the image, and you can judge for yourself to see if it sort of makes the sound, does it give it more readability, perhaps is one way of putting it. Oops. Hang on 1 second. Yeah, so as I was kind of experimenting with that software, I kind of tried to kind of work with my sound with keeping in mind the image, and created a whole batch of sort of like an image library of these like sound drawings, so to speak, which I attempted to animate somewhat crudely, and then use the same sounds back to respond to them. So I'll just play you a short clip before I wrap up of the sort of work in progress so far. So that's all I have to share. Thanks for listening. Yeah.